Yes. All right, we're back with our friends Nasser and Ham to talk about building the better villain. Back here with Pickled Dragon Unscripted. Several people have sent us questions about building a bad guy for their campaign, and it's actually quite a complex topic, because when you think about a villain, you want something that the party is motivated. They have to have a reason to go fight this evil in their land, as opposed to go over here and search this dungeon for treasure. Because it'd be very easy for a pack of heroes, if they have no skin in the game, to say, I don't care about what's going on over here because there's gold over there. So you gotta really give the party a reason to battle this evil. And so we're gonna talk about that. How do you is this, and that's really the question, is how do you get the party to care, right? So Nasser and Ham and I we went on for almost an hour talking about villains, essentially. So I'm going to kick it to Nasser first. Just a quick overview of what, why don't we, you know what might be interesting? Let's start with just a few of your ideas, but what we'll close with is villains from our own games that had an impact and why. I've got a few stories to tell, but part of the conversation also is the villain. Creating a villain can go too far as well, and it's easy to do. It's very easy to do, and I've got a story about that as well. So Nasser, what do you think about what do you think the number one characteristic of a good villain is?
I would like to answer that one, but I'm more interested in seeing Ham's approach, because I want to expand the question a bit more once he's done doing his thing. But to answer your question, I think a good villain is one that is relatable. Like, you can see the human side of that villain. Those are always the best villains. Like, you can always say, oh, this is the big bad, but if there's no motivation for the party to, like, if they don't see him as a human being, they won't take him as seriously. That's how I feel, at least from my point of view. If they don't see the human side of the villain.
Relatability.
Yeah.
Well, okay. A villain is a storycraft device, first and foremost. So it's actually quite technical to create a villain, if you will. There are certain check boxes that you have to kind of hit, I feel, as a DM, right? So one, a villain has to have a motive, has to have something that they want to achieve, and that something that they want to achieve has to have dire being the operative word, consequences if they achieve it. And ideally, and there has to be something in their way blocking them from achieving it. So I'd say those are the first three check boxes for defining a villain, right? And by the way, you have to also keep in mind that I come from the point of view that time also matters. And when I refer to time here, I'm talking about the time that you as the DM have to run the game. So if this is a long-term campaign, you have loads of time to kind of roll out the villain's nefarious plan. But if it's a one-shot, obviously you've got to get to the bang really, really quickly, right? So if you know those three things, you're set in either case. If you know what your villain's motivation is, what's kind of in the way of them achieving it, and what the consequences are if they achieve it or as they try to achieve it, you're essentially set. You've kind of checked the storytelling requirements for that villain, okay? Now, the frills that you get to add on top of that, which is layering kind of fun nuance to the villains, goes to the relatability aspect that Nasser was talking about, but other things too. Okay. So in terms of relatability, I actually completely agree with Nasser's point. Like, I find the villain that is, you're Darth Vader. I want to sort of conquer the world and, subject everybody, or, yeah, they're fun. You need villains like that, right? But I find the villain that believes their cause is righteous and for the greater good a lot more scary than somebody like, than somebody like a Darth Vader, saying it's that inquisitor that believes they're doing something for the good of the faith. It's that doctor that really believes that this is for the betterment of that doctor or scientist that believes this is for the betterment of mankind. These kinds of villains are, well, the experience with them is more harrowing because they have very legitimate and relatable reasons for being villainous. And it almost unequivocally puts the players in a situation where they are no longer looking at things in the pure kind of fantasy adventure, black or white, good versus evil, light versus darkness kind of perspective. Now they literally face dive that spectrum of the gray in between. And that's a much more fun pool to wade into, in my opinion. And I think I had another point to add here, but it kind of slipped my mind. Just a sec. There's relatability, and there was, let me ping pong with Nasser a little bit while I regather my thoughts here. Sorry, I had a brain fart. Please excuse me. Also, let me bounce back to you for a bit.
All right. I think you also want, like, you and I agree on the same points of creating a great villain. You also want to, when I said show the human side of a villain, right? Like the relatability part, you also want to show the history of the villain as well. Like you want to, like you want the players to maybe come across why that villain, became a villain. What were the circumstances that pushed him to become a villain? You want to show those in the game, because that's where you actually show them that, see, anybody can become a bad guy, like if the circumstances put them in that situation. So when you actually do that, that also makes the villain more, I think, gives them more depth in the game. Another thing I feel is that you have to create a connection between the villain and the player. Not in all campaigns, but that connection is, I think, where the point where Matt said is like, oh, I don't want to go here, I want to go there because there's more gold. But if you create that connection between the villain and the players, then you want to give the players a motivation to go after that villain. It's like you could create the greatest villain in writing maybe and put him in a campaign. But if you don't know how to connect him with the players, or get him to be in the players, as basically the stumbling block that stops the players from doing what they have to do, then I think all that hard work just went out the window. So I'm gonna take it back to Ham.
You actually hit the nail right on the head. It's two things that sound similar, but are actually quite separate, at least in my mind. And that's making sure that the players have some skin in the game when it comes to whatever nefarious modus operandi that the villain is kind of executing, right? And the second is to make it personal. Like and here's the difference between the two. It almost sounds, having skin in the game and making it personal sound very similar. But again, I draw a distinction. It's the difference between when a villain, through their villainous mode, affects the environment that the players are in, and so the situation that the players are in, and so those characters have to react to what the villain or the villainous agents are actually doing in the story. It's it's the Goblin Raiders attacking the village, okay? Versus making it personal. It's the Goblin Raiders attacking the village and actually hurting or harming somebody that's related to the players or the players themselves, or taking something from the players, and so they go hand in hand, but they're quite separate, because you can achieve And in fact, if you really want to have fun with it, actually stagger them, start with something that's more kind of like, situational or environmental, and then make it really, really personal to the player characters. If you have the luxury of the time to roll out the villainous agenda that way, I'd recommend it. But the idea is that what you're really doing here with these 2 points is you're answering the question, why should the players care? Why should the protagonists of the adventure care about the villainous agenda? And that's another very important storytelling device, right? That's another checkbox to actually tick when you, as a DM, are designing or selecting a villain from the pool of characters or NPCs that you've already introduced or exposed your players to. So this, again, brings us to another sort of tangent, sort of, from this point, or a derivative point, if you will, which is, do you design villains at the onset, or do you allow emergent play to kind of define those villains for you? And the reality is both work. Both work. But you always find that the storytelling device is what will dictate how much the players actually care. So I remember and I'd like to sort of jump into Matt's, the second half of Matt's question, which is, to exemplify some of this, right? So I had a villain that I'd worked on, like really, really poured over, gave him like lots of background history. And I'm not gonna bore you guys with all these details. Suffice it to say that I created this villain that was supposed to be the mastermind at work in the background, unhatching this sort of nefarious plot across the realm, and had loads and loads of agents at his disposal. And when I say agents, I mean parties that represent him or her in one form or another. And they were basically making the players' lives miserable. But there was this repeating character that was actually a random encounter. What do you call it? Table roll result, right? It was this an archmage, and basically this archmage appeared, and I had to figure out a reason for how to turn that crazy dice roll that had nothing to do with the price of fish or the scene at the time and make it meaningful to my plot. And so, like, I actually took a quick timeout from my players, went and made a few rolls and leaned on some tables to sort of help sort of guide my creative process. And this guy threw them on a bit of a bender. The way it worked out was that this guy would keep, well, what he did then and there was he disrupted their plans. Whatever it is they were trying to do, he threw them into this crazy sort of other dimensional sort of maze. And he was just toying with them like they were lab rats, right? And when they succeeded, they got very little reward for their efforts. In fact, it really it bled them. It bled them in terms of resources. It bled them in terms of the magics that they could use and their magical items and stuff like that. It really drained the party's sort of resources, if you will, right? And then they had to continue go resume the adventure path, if you will, what they had originally intended to do, with this person sort of having, this random encounter rather having drained them. But what ended up happening was, a few sessions later, I made this character a bit of a repeating character, and I started creating reasons for why he was toying with these specific players. And when the players started cluing in to that, this secondary character became the character that they loved to hate, because every dilemma, every impossible situation he would put them in was so troublesome to them, was so irritating and infuriating and exacerbating to them, that they were like, oh God, this jerk again. So actually they were, insert your choice of expletives for what they would use to describe this guy. And then they'd go ahead and do it. But as they were doing it, they started uncovering this side story. It's kind of like the plot B in the campaign. And then, organically over time, again, because we had the luxury of weeks, actually, what am I talking about? Almost 2 years in this campaign, to sort of start tying that plot B. And eventually it actually took over plot A, the big Darth Vader style big bad that I put in there. The players finally encountered him and defeated him, but there was this, hey, surprise twist. You know what I'm saying? It's actually all related back to this plot B thing that was going on in the background. And that's something that's also kind of in the design, right? So I guess, Matt, I didn't give very specific examples because I didn't want to deep dive into the details of a very nuanced campaign that lasted well over 2 years. But I hope that in the broad strokes, I satisfied your question.
Yeah, you know, I think, and Nasser, you used a word that I think is critically important when you are building a campaign, and in particular, trying to create memorable characters, and that is the word show. Like when I do my writing, my wife, she's my editor. She reads all my stuff, and early on, she'd be like, "You need to show and not tell. Show, have in an action that happens to the party, or you know, they have to experience whatever's going on in the moment as a way of communicating the depredations of this villain or whatever, rather than just saying, okay, he's murdered this many orphans, he's burned this many towns, he's stolen this many virgins, and he's, you know, done all these different things. He's a bad guy. You know, that it does not create a villain. You have to show and not tell. So the party's in a village, and suddenly there's screams and shouts, and this war band is riding through doing this thing, and they're carrying the standard. So the next piece of that is DMs, I think, often get excited, and they want to show their players all these cool things that they've been working on for so long, all at once. Well, I don't do a lot of one shots, because that running a one shot is a completely different animal. I run campaigns, and so I take my time, you know, slowly unfold these things, and you have constant callbacks to the important details. So if that first encounter is just a war party with a standard, maybe next time it's a war party with a standard who's calling out the name for Hans Drubel, you know, and so now you have a name, and you have this standard, and you just slowly let it build on itself until the party finally realizes, oh, there's this guy who's doing something, and then maybe they actually meet this guy, but take your time and let it do the slow burn, you know, and give it dimension. You sprinkle in details, and details are often, it's tough because details are often lost in between sessions. Your players aren't constantly living the experiences of the characters, so it's easy for those things to get bogged down, which is why callbacks, when you use this method, callbacks to those details, reminders. A lot of times when they come to the table and they're like, I just can't remember this detail, I'm like, all right, everyone make a wisdom check. So everyone roll, somebody's bound to roll well enough. Okay, you remember this, you know, and you can kind of keep them on that road and until the final payoff. And Nasser, you also mentioned making them a human with human motivations, and Ham, you know, when you talk about them being true believers in their cause, it's easy to say, oh, I'm working for Orcus, and I'm an Orcus worshiper, and I've got these 100,000 followers. Well, what motive would 100,000 people have to follow a demon lord? You know, like they live, and when we talked about gods in previous shows, you know, you live in a world where there is concrete evidence that all of these gods exist. There is no question that there is the seven heavens, there's hell, there's Elysium. There is zero question of that. So what motive would all of these people have to be demon worshippers or you know, Tharis Dune worshippers, you know? So that's a very tough question, tough nut to crack, which is why I think it's important to I always try to keep cults separate from, you know, the grounded religions. And so that is a very tough nut to crack, you know. And I, you know, for my campaigns, you know, maybe it's greed is the motivation, you know. So a lot of people are short-sighted, you know. I could live my best life in this life and worry about the afterlife later, you know, but on what scale will that work? It doesn't work on a huge scale. So to give some examples, like I have taken the Tharizdun god in my current campaign and really extrapolated it out and thought it through. He's the chain god, the mad god. Lunatics follow him. It's easy to say this asylum of people have risen up, and now you have this cult, you know, banging their tambourines across the countryside, worshiping Tharizdun, the mad god, because they're all crazy too, right? But I wanted to give him, and this is actually a piece of information that my party doesn't know yet. They're close to finding it out, but I wanted to give the mad god a sympathetic bent. Like, this is very important to me. When I construct a villain, I try to think of their motivation, and like Nasser, you said, the terms of humanity. I want them to have a sympathetic bent. Like, everyone sitting at a table should be able to say, I can see why this person in an unhinged state would think this way, and would want to do these things, even though they're terrible. They got to be stopped, but I understand, you know, that you have. So Tharizdun, in my world, he's one of the first gods, and he was put down by the rest of the gods because he attempted to unweave everything, unweave reality, unweave a creation. What the party doesn't know yet is why. Like, they just, oh, he's the bad god. That's why. I just attribute it to that. So when you think about the gods, well, what comes before gods? You know, it's kind of like what came before the Big Bang, you know. So I have kind of like a wheel of time perspective on it. So there's kind of a pattern. So before there were gods, there are these ephemeral kind of forces that I call fate and destiny. So fate and destiny are always playing off one another. And eventually what came of that are the gods. Well, just like the gods, when they're trying to create life, the gods are dabbling. They haven't created the material plane yet. They haven't created humanity, elvish kind. They haven't done any of those things yet, but they're figuring out that they have the ability to create life. And Tharizdun is a god that through his works of creation, he is responsible for amorphous things like slimes and oozes and you know, things that don't have form and don't have shape. And in the course of doing so, he harms himself. And so his madness comes from the excruciating pain that he always feels. He's always in pain. He's always suffering. And it eventually has driven him mad, and he's convinced himself, well, the only way I can stop this is to uncreate everything and start over. And hope that fate and destiny see fit to start everything anew. So I want to destroy everything and hope that I'm given a second chance. And even if I'm not, at least the pain is over, you know. But in doing so, you know, he's wiping out all of these life across the multiverse, right? And of course, the gods are going to oppose that. But so this is going to be a revelation that they're going to find out fairly soon. We're on session like 22 or 23 of this campaign, and I think I have effectively built up a number of villains. So they know Tharizdun is kind of like, he's kind of like Sauron, you know, in Lord of the Rings. No one ever actually sees him. They just know he's a bad guy, but people are constantly interacting with Nazguls and, you know, and all of the petty villains below that. And so those are the villains that I think that really require a lot of work because, and so what the other thing I do is I have lots of villains, right? And I sprinkle them about, I see which ones cause the most pain points, and then I run with those guys. And that was something I learned years ago, like I guess it was 2004 or something. I had this villain and it just wasn't going. We played for like a third. I guess it was a third of the campaign. The campaign ran 5 years. And I just couldn't find, I kept trying to force this villain in and shoehorn him in, and I just couldn't feel it. And then one day, I as a side, I thought, well, this would be fun to run this character as a dead player character. That I decided, well, his body it's kind of a Tolkien-esque thing where fell spirits will inhabit the body of the dead, and it'll create a Barrow Wight, in Lord of the Rings terms. Well, instead, I had this spirit inhabit this guy, and it was a spirit of chaos. I was kind of inspired by the Joker. I think I just read the final joke. I can't remember which the comic book series was, but so I made this little Joker style character out of this, and boy, did the players go nuts. Like, I can't stand that guy. He keeps doing all these things to us. And so I was like, okay, this is the guy. So in a third of the way in the campaign, I'm just like, I'm making a shift, and I couldn't have, that was the best decision ever. So I'm kind of rambling now, but and I think that there's a lot here to unpack, because we have just thrown out quite a bit. We've talked about shades of gray. I think that unless the DM is running like a really classic Tolkien-esque, there's either good or there's evil, and there's nothing in between. Unless you're running that, shades of gray is a very important. And I think it's important to explore what is evil and what is good, because not all evil people will go as far as murder, say. Like, they might steal that last piece of candy from a kid's mouth. They might be willing to sell a bridge to some unsuspecting rich guy, but they may not go so far as to say murder somebody. Whereas somebody else might be, have no qualms about doing anything, and that too is evil, right? So, but that's on a spectrum of the worst of the worst, Ted Bundy, all the way on the evil scale, all the way up to the brightest light of goodness there is, and there's everything in between. In fact, most things are in between. I think it's real important to take your time when developing those villains, and think about allowing the players to interact with NPCs that maybe you wouldn't have ever considered in the past, because they aren't always the heroic types. Because evil can sometimes oppose evil if the evil is that they're opposing is so bad that even Cyril or some of these other terrible gods might be like, yeah, this is no good. We don't want this happening. So have you guys ever explored down that road? Have you ever had your players have to turn to the lesser evil, let's say, for help? And in what way? I have tons of examples, but I've been rambling long enough.
Yeah, I played in campaigns where we had to deal with one evil like entity versus the other, because this is the lesser evil. Like for example, a simple example, we were playing in a campaign where we were going up against this weapons dealer who sold a lot of magical items, and this guy was very powerful, so basically untouchable. He was our rival when we started the campaign, but then towards the end of the campaign we found out, oh, there's somebody worse, so we have to play ball with this guy to defeat the big bad in the end. Otherwise, we need this guy's help, so we need to make peace with him. And so, yeah, we managed to do that, and and beat the big bad in the end, because this was the bigger evil. This is going to destroy the world. This guy's just causing havoc with his selling magical items all over.
Had a very similar situation, almost a very similar setup to that as well. There's a smuggler / arms dealer that was really in the campaign. This person was very hell-bent on profiteering from playing sides off each other. So not only was he an arms dealer, but he's somebody who'd actually sow the seeds of war so that people would have to conflict. He'd create problems, people would have to conflict, and then he'd sell them the weapons and sell to both sides so that, he was constantly making his fortune off the back of that. But over the course of the campaign, what happens is that the characters kind of run into this, a more sort of nefarious and more immediate and more pressing sort of situation with worse consequences. And even that bad guy gets affected by these consequences. And I'd like to earmark this point and come back to Matt's point that he mentioned earlier, which I'd like to build on or expound on about show, not tell. But just throw me a reminder, Matt, if you don't mind. But basically, they ended up having to partner with this guy's, not just this guy, but that faction, if you will, just because they were the best equipped to be able to deal with the big bad. The players needed somebody with the network. They needed somebody with the resources. They needed somebody who could get them there, who knew the smuggling routes, who knew all the secret nooks and crannies to actually take to get to the ultimate big bad, if you will, in the story. So yes, it's been in that situation. And the thing is, there was severe moral clash because some of the players had, by that point, had very personal beef with this particular smuggler character and his faction, because some of the player characters had lost family members. One of the player characters, his entire people got wiped out by the war, by the consequences of the wars that this guy started. They hated him. And these weren't background things. These were emergent things. These are things that happened in play. So in fact, allow me a moment to actually address the show, not tell aspect of things. Matt used a wonderful example earlier of maybe you see these guys holding a banner and what have you. I would have, the way I did it in my own campaign was, first, there was a red herring sort of quest. It's the quests where you send the players at their low levels just so they can level up. So it's like, go kill the kobolds, go do this and that. Very simple sort of things that you do. But on the back of that, in the town, when they're collecting rumors and stuff like that, they hear about this warmonger, basically a warlord that's kind of doing their thing. And you kind of send them down a path, you send the players down a path, and they really believe that they're following a trajectory now. And there's the equivalent of, one or two quest givers in the enclave that they're stationed out of. They go, they finish this amazing quest, and they're coming back to reap their rewards, only the place has been burnt down. And it's the aftermath of that warlord striking that enclave while they were away. And now they can actually see those rumors brought to life right there. And not only that, but it has very personal consequences on them, because their inn got burnt down. Their wealth got taken. People they know and cared about were killed or abducted, etc. and so forth. And it's kind of like, and it turns into this big investigation, and they figure out who's doing what, and it kind of sets them up on that path. So show not tell is actually a really, really fantastic way to go down this route. But sorry, I kind of digressed over there. But the point is that there were a lot of personal stakes for the players by that point. And they hated this guy. They really, really despised them. But because the big bad, the more pressing need, forced them to kind of work together, he ended up saving one of their lives. And actually, he ended up saving the life of the player who hated him the most, and yet was the most honorable paladin in the party. And that guy really felt stuck, because here he is. He's got a moment at the very end. He had a moment where he could actually exact vengeance on the guy, and do what's right. But he just couldn't. He couldn't. He's like, the guy saved my life, the adventure or the circumstances had made for some strange bedmates, and they ended up, this was never a resolved thing in the campaign. Their hatred for this smuggler, who was the focus of a large, I would say a significant, a very significant portion of the campaign. Like his machinations were like really things that kind of riled the players up. But towards the end, it was never resolved. They resolved the big bad, but they agreed to part ways, as some of them looked at it as we're frenemies, and some of them were like, until our paths cross again, and maybe we won't be so kind to each other, sort of thing. It was, you know, that was the situation. So it was a wonderful. And there were situations where the opposite was true as well. It wasn't a question of, you know, having to choose one evil over the other. It was having to not follow somebody who was good, who was completely misguided. The prince who sought the attention of his father, the king, and would never get it because he would never be as good as his father, starts doing really bad stuff when he becomes king. And he's not as good as his father. And yet these are the players were sworn men to the throne of that kingdom. And now they've got to start thinking like, oh crap, we, you know, in good conscience, we can't represent this guy. And yet for all the bad things that you know, king did, he also coupled it with a lot of good things, and the good things were personal to the players. They were, and that really makes it hard for the players to have to kind of, you know, choose what to do. And then, of course, you know, being the jerk DM that I am, I have to throw the carrot at them, right? I have to dangle it at the end of the stick. There has to be a villainous party that actually says a coup. We should get rid of him, you know, and that's the party that's actually directly opposed to this, you know, fallible king, if you will. And instead of fighting the players, they say, join us. So the invitation is thrown out to them in that regard. And the players have to mull that over. And those are very fun, interesting kind of situations to put the players in, where they get to kind of explore, well, what is right and what is wrong and what's morally acceptable and what is not. And, you know, does my oath trump what I have to do? You know, what this guy's asking me to do and how that sits with me morally, etc. and so forth. So it's, these kinds of things, if you as a DM find yourself in a situation where, you know, you're kind of feeding off what the players give you through their interactions with the environment you put them in, right? And that is a great opportunity to milk that for what it's worth. Because I think creating a villain is not about creating characters. It's about creating situations and consequences and temptations for the players. I think if one was to approach role-playing a villain that way, it can lead to some very interesting inter-party dynamics, if you will, right? So it's less of, this guy's Darth Vader and he's dressed in, you know, black and he's wielding a lightsaber. I love going back to the Darth Vader examples, I'm really sorry. But, you know, it's just, he's like the ultimate big bad, right? But, you know, instead of that, it's, you know, a situation where the players are kind of like, crap, you mean I have to work with him now? Or should I work with him? Because he's actually going to be better at it than I am, or he's going to be able to help us out. Or she is an absolutely, you know, repugnant person, and yet she's got the key for what we need, and we're going to have to do something good for her. You know what I'm saying, etc. Putting these questions is really, really fantastic in there. And temptations, wherever you find the players, like if they latch on to a moral stance, tempt them. That's your storytelling device. Tempt them to go the other way. Give them 110 reasons. Actually, just give them one good reason. But if you could think of 110, do it. By all means, I encourage you. You know, give them reasons to not believe wholeheartedly in their cause, and then throw that temptation their way, and make sure the bad guy is the one that gives it to them. Because at a minimum, that's going to say, put your swords down. Now stop and think.
Yeah, there is. I like to, whenever I introduce an NPC, unless like the party's gone shopping or something, I don't go that far. But when I look at my games, I always, whether the party players, I should say, whether the players remember or not, I know in my mind, virtually every NPC, every encounter, even if they're traveling, you know, from point A to point B, which I look at travel as an adventure in and of itself. Every encounter, every NPC they meet somehow usually relates back or twists its way back into the storyline somehow. So I look at NPCs more as tools to further the story or to make a mark on the party, that whether that mark is to build up the reputation of the villain or to give the party more motivation to continue on. Whatever the case, I try to make sure everything relates back to the main storyline. But I also think that we need to think about what happens when a DM goes too far. You know, how does, you know, DMs can go too far. And I think we typically, it's done by accident. I don't think anyone sets out to upset somebody, or I've had players cry at my table and it wasn't a good thing. That was back in the 2nd edition days, and I'll explain that story. But you know, what are a few things? What are when building a villain, aside from the show don't tell, where you just build up a villain through saying he's bad or she's bad, what are some things that you could point out that are that would take a villain too far? And sometimes it's not necessarily about the villain, but it's more about the player.
Mm-hmm. I would say it's always more about the player, Matt.
The social contract.
Yeah, it's what it comes down to. The thing is, right, I remember in one of my, so I ran the Curse of Strahd campaign beginning to end twice, and with 2 different groups. And actually Nasser was playing in one of those groups. And in Nasser's game, he'll remember this situation actually. So here's an example of accidentally taking things too far. So there was a, and this again goes off the back of,
Lack of knowledge.
please excuse me. Let me backtrack and create context for this, right? So we had done a session 0. The expectations of the players were managed. We said that we agreed. There was an agreement that the game would be a little bit dark and it would touch on themes of death and loss and sorrow and things like that. And it would be a very grim setting, not grim as in like grim dark, if you will, like, you know, as the genre. That's not what I'm talking about, but bleak is the right word. It'd be a bleak setting. It would be not a very happy or jovial kind of place, which Barovia, I think for us, for those of us who've played there or run games there, kind of, you know, that's one of the first things you pick up on, that it's not a very pleasant place. So I had doubled down on that theme for the setting. It was very, people were miserable and the players were having a hard time finding kind of places where they could find genuine sort of succors, almost like every act of kindness or goodness was poisoned in some way in that setting. And it was going fine for the most part in the campaign. The players had accepted that. They were okay with it. They were intent on seeing the campaign through. There were no problems. And I had no means of foreseeing this situation. And the situation in a nutshell got triggered by a description that I gave, where the players had just emerged out of a very intense, sort of escaped by the skin of our teeth kind of situation, where they almost TPK'd, and only to find that instead of their horses, there was a wagon over there, and on it was a coffin, and inscribed on the coffin was the module actually tells you to inscribe the name of one of the players on that coffin, but in one of the player characters' backgrounds, this person's reason for wanting to leave Barovia, she was one of the paladins in the group, and her reason for leaving Barovia, she was on her way home to see her sick father after having received a letter from from her homeland, saying that her father was on his deathbed in his last throes, basically, and she wanted to get back on time, but the mists of Barovia had sucked her up, interrupting her journey back home. And what I did was I had the inscription on the coffin read the name of her father, okay, thinking that I would get a bit of a shock or a bit of a sort of like, a gasp sort of from the player. When she broke down into tears, we had to kind of stop the game, and I had to take her to the side and, sort of dig in a little bit and see what was going on, because I wasn't sure that, given how we had been playing so far, why that particular event was so triggering in the way that it was. And it had nothing to do with the game. Her father was extremely sick. The player's father was extremely sick. And this happened, obviously, after the campaign had started. We were already well into it. It was an unforeseen thing. It's not like she built her character to mirror her life's events, or our life circumstances, but it's just something that had happened. And that particular, simple, unintentionally triggering sort of description that I gave her hit really close to home. It hit a little too close to home for her. And so, as a DM, as a person, as a just, self-respecting human being, we have to snap out of role playing, kind of sit down, chat, listen to her a little bit, talk her through, change the mood, really just come back to reality, and just sort of remember that, we're there, we're all friends first and foremost, we're supportive, we care, we listen. And, then it was kind of like, all right, guys, let's just cut from that scene. And I think we dropped it. We never really resolved. I don't remember now. So we didn't really resolve that scene, did we? We just sort of moved on from there.
No, we stripped, we took away the part where that had, where you said.
Yeah, we retconned it, I think, right?
Yeah,
we did something. We tinkered with the game a bit, but we just sort of moved on from there. So that was an unintentional example, or an example rather, of an unintentional going too far kind of thing. I can give you another example where it was intentional, but and I think I may have gone too far. I don't know yet to this day. What I do know is that the player will never stop talking about it, and especially about how disturbing it was. So this particular character was a bard in a slightly, let's call it, for want of a better word, a Viking-esque sort of setting. And he was a half-elf in a predominantly human tribe. And his father was this wandering elf that would move around from place to place and be far from home for a long time. And in the beginning of the game, these, I think Nasser was in that game as well, actually. And in this game, there was stuff going on in town. There was completely unrelated plots. And, sometimes I like introducing, not villains as such, but NPCs with villainous personalities, in the sense that they act as an antagonizing force against a specific player or a group of players within the party. And so this guy comes home. We have essentially this half-elf kid in the village. I'm talking about the character, not player, who seeks the approval of his father. He wants to be a bard, just a successful, renowned bard, just like his dad. And his father comes home after many, many years of being away, and brings him a puppy, a snow wolf. And what do you call it? In the time that this guy's been away, his elven charms have enchanted the mother. So she fell into the human mother. So she was deeply depressed, and almost her health was waning because he was away. And the father character was really frivolous and doesn't really think in these emotional terms and things like that. But in any case, the boy was basically trying to, I say boy because they were playing children in the game, youths, 13, 14 years old. He was really trying to kind of make a mark on his father. And so he wanted to perform at the local sort of tavern or the if you will, the hall, the mead hall, and kind of, earn the respect of his father. And being the jerk that I am, after doing that, his father watches the show, doesn't acknowledge him at all. And by the time the boy gets home, he finds the puppy with its neck snapped on his bed. And essentially it was, I didn't, I revealed this after a little bit, but essentially it was a message from the father saying, you're not worthy of taking care of a puppy because you spend too much time outdoors. You simply did not care for this dog. You don't deserve a puppy, sort of thing. And yeah, that didn't go down very well. That didn't go down. I think that was a bit mean on my part. So I think I
Don't
might
hurt
have.
the puppies.
Don't hurt the puppies.
Don't
Never
hurt
hurt
the
the
puppies.
puppies.
That's
Never
rule
hurt.
number 2. No puppy
yeah.
hurting.
So I might have taken it. Okay, fine. I took it too far. Not a tad too far. I took it a little too far. But yeah, that's an example of. And to my credit, the only example I could think of where I deliberately took things a little overboard, I suppose.
Nasser, what do you got?
I think I've always been very careful with players. Like I try not to. I think the only time I feel that with villains I went too far, and I wouldn't call them villains. I would probably call them more henchmen. I was running a group of players and new players, and I noticed that a lot of times they were making a lot of mistakes that, even for me, like, new players don't make mistakes. These guys need a lot of work. So how do I teach them? Maybe through consequences in the game. They're going to learn that certain things you shouldn't do in the game because you're going to, get in trouble. So towards the end of it's like a mini campaign, they were on an airship. And what did they do? The typical thing that, all new players do: split the party.
You can cover more ground that way.
Yeah. Split the party. And what happened was they got picked off on the airship one by one. So we got to this last player. There's this girl. She's still playing D&D, by the way. And she got into combat and she got knocked down. And I was describing how the bad guy was gonna, what he does in the end, which is slit the throat of the PC. I think that went too far because there was a reaction on the table, and she has not played with me as a DM ever since. But she's played with me in campaigns as players, like we role play with each other. But she has not played with me as a. So sometimes you don't know. You're describing a scene, and maybe for you it comes out as a normal scene. Yeah, your character is being killed right now. I'm just describing it. But for the other person, it might be something very
triggering.
Yeah, triggering.
I'm sorry I jumped in like that, but you're right. It goes back to that sort of full circle to that initial point. Like, it really comes down to the players. But I suppose I'd add to that sometimes there's a poor read. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're not right all the time as a DM. You don't always make the best decisions all the time. And, it's your learning curve, right? In a way, like you may mean well, and that might have worked with some types of players, but it doesn't work with everybody. And you kind of have to adjust.
To answer Matt's thing, I think to combat that for not happening, you need to have, like, the session 0 is always going to be mentioned in every DM panel or any DM discussion. It's really important. So I think session 0 and the social contract. Social contract is basically stuff that you shouldn't touch upon. Like, for example, this new campaign that is coming up, one of the players said, "I have a problem with spiders." Do not include spiders in that campaign. Don't even describe them to me. I was like, okay, done. You're not going to get spiders. Are cockroaches allowed? So they're like, okay, I have no problem with cockroaches. But it's things like that. If done like early on, you can avoid that with your villains. Like, okay, I don't want my villain to hurt, like, for example, in some games, I don't want them to hurt kids or hurt,
But it can happen also despite the contract, right? So that for that Viking game, there was a session 0, and we did talk about it, and everybody was fine with the idea that it would be a gritty Viking kind of setting, very akin to the Vikings movie. That was what we compared it to, like people were getting, what's it called, blood eagled and stuff like that in there, right? So I thought that going that, I don't know, like, it seems to me that the more, my takeaway, I guess that's what I want to come to. My takeaway from that experience was that being garish and crude in the encounter setup is always going to be a hit or miss endeavor. Why risk it? And so in the games going forward from there, I saw no point to it because you can achieve the same desired outcome through different avenues, basically, right? But you know, like I said, it was a bit of a learning curve, I have to admit. Like I did not personally at that time see anything wrong with displaying a villain who would do something like that. And by the way, it's not that I condone that kind of thing at all, right? It was just for that character, for that scene. But the backlash from the reaction I got from the party, even though they were very respectful and polite, and you know, nobody actually outright, you know, said anything. I mean, the emotional reaction from the Curse of Strahd situation was a lot more
Intense.
yeah, a lot more intense, you know. But at the same time, I saw that it had an impact on my players, and it wasn't a good one. And to me, that just says these kinds of things, they detract from the fun and from the overall experience at the table. So are they really worth it? You know, they're not. You know, and so that was basically my conclusion. From
They work more in a novel than in a game.
yeah, or maybe a TV series or something like that than in a game. But again, I go back to saying, I guess it really depends on the players too, right? Like when I say the players, it's not that I'm putting an onus of responsibility on them. I'm referring to their character and their own kind of, let's call it, level of sensitization to things like that. That's what I meant by it comes down to the players.
I have two experiences that taught me a lot. The first one is fairly simple, and it shaped a later campaign, and that is having another player act as the villain. I had a player who he really wanted to play a villain. And in retrospect, I probably should have said no, because knowing the person, I'm not saying this should never be done. I'm just saying you need to be careful, because this guy was always a bit of a joker, a bit of a prankster, and he was not beneath you know, making fun of somebody, you know, as a just because, you know, he gets a laugh, right? And so I had another player who he was playing a fighter. This is like circa 1983, and we were playing Haida Second Edition, and his character was playing a fighter, and in his backstory, he went adventuring to support his elderly parents. So he was always, they'd find gold and he would always send some back to his parents. And this other player who was actually playing the villain was actually part of the party at first. And that's kind of like the way he monitored their actions. He kind of sandbagged or played down his abilities, because obviously everyone was at first level and he was a villain, right? And he actually worked for the Saruman type guy, right? But he was kind of the main agent. And one of the things he would do is, you know, they would fight a bunch of wyverns, and he would well, for my cut of the treasure, can I just have the wyvern eggs? And everyone would be like, sure, take the wyvern eggs. He found cockatrice eggs, or you know, and then he started this menagerie of monsters. And so when the secret got out that he was actually an agent for a villain, one of the things, the person that found out and busted his cover essentially was this player that's playing the fighter. So in retaliation, the player villain went and kidnapped his parents. And he was like, all right, you know, if you don't do what I say, your parents are going to suffer. And that in and of itself wasn't too bad. You know, like that was a logical thing to do, right? Like hit the players where they're soft, right? Well, then he would this was years into the campaign, and his cockatrices had hatched and were being trained. His wyverns had hatched and were being trained. And so at first he had the parents of the fighter turned to stone by the cockatrice, and then he positioned them up on this palisade of this keep for him to see, like, hey, here's your parents, if you want them, we can get a spell to restore them, but you've got to, he taunt them with these statues of his parents, right? Well, later, finally, he settled on extorting the player to get the parents back. And he's like, the fighter's like, fine, I'll give you whatever you want. So he came up with, I think, a magic item and a large sum of gold. And when the player turned over, he's like, all right, I want my parents now. The villain had 2 bags delivered to him. And when he opened them up, it was wyvern crap. He had fed the parents to the, and he's like, well, you could resurrect them with this, what's left. And I was like, man, that is like going a little, but it was like, to this guy, it was laughable. It was like a big joke. And, and so in retrospect, I don't see a problem. And in fact, I've had player villains later, but I was always very careful about making that choice and thinking about who could handle that role responsibly, right? And the other thing I learned over the time that comes to my second story, and this is knowing your players. So I had, and this again was 2nd edition. This was probably the mid-90s. At that time there was a monster called a skeletal warrior. It's very descriptive, skeletal warrior, but they're created by mages. And their souls are trapped usually, and I may have told this story before, but their souls are trapped in a circlet. And whoever possesses the circlet can bend the will of the skeletal warrior. The skeletal warrior still has free will, and still has all of their memories and so forth. It's just they're forced to do the bidding of whoever owns their circlet. So when I read the description of the skeletal warrior, and I was kind of coming up with a way of how would a necromancer go about creating a skeletal warrior, and I came to the conclusion that nowhere in the text did it say that it had to be a circlet. It could be anything to hold the soul. So the party was fighting this necromancer, and one of the party had been captured, and she was a paladin. The player was actually a female. She was a paladin. So I thought that was even better. Like if I could turn a paladin into a skeletal warrior, that would even be, more of like a heinous act on the part of the villain. So I had to have these role play sessions, and it just so happened that the player who was playing the captured paladin was going to be gone. So we actually corresponded via letters, writing letters, like the old school, snail mail, which is hilarious, because I think I still have them somewhere. But I had to know what this player was going to do while they were imprisoned by this necromancer. So she was in this prison, and for the first few days she was by herself in this prison, at least in her cell. There was an adjoining cell where there was this older guy, but they are always kept in absolute darkness. So she couldn't see anything, but she carried on a conversation with this neighboring cellmate, and he had been there for years. And so he was real excited about having a cellmate. He was a little bit unhinged, and there was a lot of dialogue back and forth. But eventually, a girl of about 12 years old, I can't remember what it was, joined her in her cell. And periodically there was this orc torturer who would show up, drag the paladin off and torture away and do terrible things, trying to extract her for information. about the party, and she would make her rolls and write them down on the letter, and she mailed the results back. It was very old school. But eventually the orc would be like, all right, if you won't talk, maybe I'll take the girl that's in the cell with you. And she was like, oh, you can't do that. You can't do that. And in the meantime, the party was trying to figure out where she was kept and mount a rescue. And it took a couple months, and that would have been like 8 sessions. But it took a couple months for them to figure out where she was being held, and they launched this rescue. When they broke into the tower where she was being held, of course, she was always held in complete darkness. They go and they check her out, and her flesh is rotting off her body. She's obviously undead. The bones are starting to show through. She'd been turned into one of these skeletal warriors. And when they shone light on the little girl that was there, that was trapped with her, she was very familiar. Like, they couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something very familiar about this girl, like they'd known her at some point in the campaign in their past. Well, what it turned out to be was they confronted the necromancer. The necromancer's like, you have to let me go, but in exchange, because they subdued him, defeated him in combat, you have to let me go, but in exchange, I will tell you where her soul is trapped, and if you free it, she'll be able to be restored and not be undead anymore. Well, he had trapped her soul in the body of this little girl who was a simulacrum of the paladin. So it was like a clone of the paladin who was growing up. And so the only way for her to get her soul back would be to kill herself, this little girl. And she was just started crying because she, by this point, she was back. She was in the session, and she was crying, not a little bit, but a lot, at the idea of having to kill a little girl. Not just a little girl, but herself. Is like suicide and murdering, like infanticide, sort of. And it was just like, it didn't really occur to me that, one, this was not the right player to do this with, because she was always a little, very easily weepy, at things, and it was just a bad call on my part. But at the same time, it was a very villainous arc that took months to unwind. And it's one of those things that my old group still talks about to this day. It was 2 groups ago, so it was back in the 90s, but it taught me another lesson, and that was, know your players very well before you go diving into the.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I think, where I relate a lot to what you were saying, Matt, and by the way, let me just sort of preface that with, that is an awesome plot. I have to say, like, just from a storytelling kind of a creative perspective, I really like what you did there. That's really, really cool. But you're absolutely right. It's a question of sort of having a good read of your players, and it's a learning curve. It is a learning curve. The interesting thing about what you said is that sometimes it's just really, really difficult to anticipate, because villains, I think as a DM, you kind of get to indulge your own vanity in trying to see how villainous your villains can be. And, especially like if you're, an early DM that's inspired by pulp fiction and like some of the older types of literature, like, it can get really dark and gritty quite fast. Like I find it to be an almost natural direction to kind of go towards. It's not necessarily palatable today, just given how the play style, I would say, has progressed.
Evolved.
Yeah, how it's evolved, essentially, right? And this is not a knock on it in any way, shape, or form. It just goes back to say that, people and attitudes and, what one sort of group of people might be sensitive to, another group might be completely, sort of foo-foo, they might not necessarily see it as something too terrible and what have you. And so, it kind of happens. It happens that way. But it really begs the question of, where as a DM do you land in that sort of balance? You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, it's not a question of what is too much. It's what are you willing to give up in terms of the overall experience at the table to indulge that vanity as a creator, you know, as somebody who's kind of creating this bad sort of villain and this antagonist, excuse me, in the background. And I don't know, like the mistakes. Where's Malcolm when you need him, right? Talk about like mistakes that we've made. What do you call it at the table? But like, you know, in terms of mistakes that I felt that I've made, it was, if there's anything I'd say I was extremely guilty of, especially with that dog scene, that puppy scene, it was not having regard or enough regard for the age difference and the potential background influences of my players versus my own influences and sort of, you know, from my own background and my own childhood and things like that. So I would say that, yeah, it's a bit of a balancing act. And I think the fundamental question underlying is, you know, is it worth it to give up, you know, or sacrifice the overall enjoyment at the table for the sake of indulging the vanity of having a villain that's a little too villainous in their modus operandi, you know? And I think today, invariably, I land on, no, it's not worth it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I think that comes with maturity.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't have the, I don't know how to put this. This is gonna sound a bit kitsch as well, but like, I don't have the stomach for the grits and for some of the things that I really liked, you know, as a kid. Like today, I'm, you know, I used to be a huge fan of zombie flicks and, you know, horror slasher movies and things like that when I was younger, but I can't, you know, digest that stuff today. Like it's, I don't know, it's, something's changed. I don't know how to articulate it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to simplify the points, like for somebody who's asked the question of how to create a better villain, like, is it like to summarize the points that we discussed today, just to this
Just
point?
sort of walk through them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What we started with when Hamed said there is give your villain motivations.
Yeah, give them a motive, give the motive consequences if it's achieved, and put some obstacles in the way of the villain.
Yeah, I want to add one more thing to motivations, is adding motivations and answering why these motivations are there. I think if you agree with that point.
Yeah, it's kind of like I mean the why is especially in a campaign. In a one shot, perhaps not as important. You could get away with skirting it, but yeah, if you can answer it, definitely a good thing.
Yeah. So that's the first thing. And the second thing
is show not tell. So basically, like, take your time to introduce the villain's modus operandi, like their method. Show it in the game, even if it's sort of carried first through rumor and then through aftermath, and then let it impact the characters, which brings us to the next point. Get them to have skin in the game, make whatever the villain does actually affect them and their environment and their circumstances, and then take it a step further later, or even at the same time. Actually, I'd recommend later. It's more dramatic if you have the luxury of time to do so. Make it personal to them. Let it really, really touch them. And I think the if memory serves me correctly, it was make your villains relatable. Yeah. Like if you can, and that goes back to the kind of the why of, you know, the why they do things, right? So if they're relatable and if they are justified, like imagine being able, ask yourself this: if I had 5 minutes alone to have a parlay, a conversation with this person to confront them on why they're doing what it is that they're doing, which actually might not be a luxury the player characters have in the campaign. But as a DM kind of creating the villain, if you could imagine that scenario and say, what would the villain say? If you have those answers clear in your head and like believe, and you as a DM believe that that character would have conviction in those answers, then you pretty much nailed it. You like, it will be compelling no matter how it manifests itself in your game. And so I'd say like, that's another very, very good thing. There's something that we touched on, but didn't actually sort of label as a point, which is, don't just, you know, work on kind of like your big villains. let villains show themselves to you or reveal themselves to you through emergent playing. So as the players interact with your setting and your story, or rather your collective story, your plot hooks and your NPCs, let them kind of reveal potential villains to you and make a villain kind of emerge from that. That's a very
organic way of
introducing a villain into the story. It's very true.
Yeah,
I think that summarizes everything, kind of.
Yeah.
I want to jump in and also add, expand on the question, because a lot of DMs do the work that, like we talked about, work really hard on these points, and I feel the failure happens is in presenting. How do you introducing your villain to the campaign is a point that a lot of I feel this is where a lot of DMs fail in doing it.
I wouldn't say fail, I'd say struggle to do it. Right? Struggle to do it. Like, because it all goes back to, again, show the villainy, right? It's show the villainy, don't just tell it. So I like a very simple, if a little formulaic way of doing it is start with the rumor, use red herrings, like really lean on them, like send the players down a path that they think is kind of like the main quest line, but unhatch the main villainous plot as a plot B first. So what I mean by kind of like plot A, plot B, plot C, you can go as high as D, E, I mean, you name it, insert letter of your choice, right? But what I mean by that is there should be multiple things going on at the same time, like in the game. So Matt brought up a really cool example right at the beginning of this session, right? He said, like, there's nothing worse, essentially, I'm paraphrasing Matt here, but there's nothing worse than you kind of preparing a villain like beforehand, and then the players saying, yeah, but there's more gold that way, so I'm not really interested. There's no investiture on the part of the players, right? So the idea is, you know, as a DM, you don't want to railroad your players ultimately, right? You want them to have free agency over their character. But the truth is, as a DM, you can anticipate that. You can anticipate that in the beginning, the players are not going to be like, all right, there's the big bad, let's go get him. You know, saying like, no, they might not want to. And if that happens, that's totally okay. Let them do what it is that they want. There's an example I gave for a one shot. And this was advice I was giving to a newer DM, where he was like, you know, okay, so I created like the starting town, like, you know, and I created this quest up in the mountains where there's these, I don't know, some creatures defending some MacGuffin up there. I don't remember the details of it now, but the principle still applies. And it was like, and all the rumors in town and all the people in town really wanted the players to help them. And, you know, to help them, the players would have to go that away, you know, up into the mountains to said lair and slay said creature and get said MacGuffin. And the players said, no, what's the opposite direction? The guy said a forest. And they're like, we go that way. So I said, okay, fair enough. What's the problem? Let them go that way. And then what you do is you take a couple of the creatures that you had up in said cave, stick them in the forest, they waylay the players, they overpower the players, they take the players' stuff, maybe even kill or harm severely one of the players, and then go back to their lair. And now it's personal. You see what I'm saying? And that's just, okay, it's a crass example. All right. Yeah. And, you know, it can be executed a lot better than that way, but the formula is the same. Show the villainous sort of method and make it affect the players. Because once it does, the players now have skin in the game, or it's really personal to them. You know what I'm saying? And that's the way you kind of gently entice them to follow that original sort of path that you had. You know what I'm saying? And then, of course, it can go the other way around as well. They go into the forest, you roll a random encounter, and suddenly that random encounter becomes your plot B. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, like what happened with that game with that villain that the players just sort of love to hate. Let things happen organically, and don't be afraid to improvise, I would say, is an important thing. Don't marry your villains. You know what I'm saying? Like pick them up and let the players tell you who the villains are.
And don't the point is,
yeah, don't be afraid to switch it up. And that's exactly it. And sorry, and I digressed a little bit there because I was talking about the plot A, plot B. There are things going on at the same time. So, you know, set the players down one path, but while they're there, the villain is not inert. The villain's doing stuff. And so maybe they're now one step closer to their villainous goal. You know what I'm saying? And there are consequences of that, and spill those consequences all over the players or all over the environment that the players are in. And, you know, if you have multiple villains in there, you know, connect them. Maybe the players like defeat something that's like a completely unrelated encounter, like, I don't know, the wyverns up in the forests or something like that. You know what I mean? But there's an egg and there's an insignia branded onto it and what have you. Like, what's this insignia? They go back to town, whatever, and somehow related back to said lair with said MacGuffin from earlier. You can interconnect these things, and it's great because even if you don't know at that time, at that particular moment, the fact that you've foreshadowed a greater network of events happening in the background is a great setup for player investiture at a minimum. Because the players are like, oh, wow, there's forces at play here that are bigger and grander than what we are. And maybe if there's the possibility, or at least the implied possibility, that if we ignore them, well, they're going to catch up with us. Maybe we should pay attention.
You said an important thing. Foreshadowing is a good thing, to add to your villain. Another point I wanted to cut you here because it's a different way. In some games or some campaigns, the villain is introduced earlier. Probably in the first or second session, you know who the main villain of the campaign is. I find that is harder than actually giving them breadcrumbs till they reach the main villain. I think because what are your thoughts on that, Ham?
I love it. I think that you as a DM, or one as a DM, should not feel that when you're at your table running your campaign, that you have to stick to exactly the spot that the players are in. And I'm going to give you a strange example. So I'm a huge fan of the cutscene. Okay, I really like interludes in my campaigns, right? It's funny, I was talking to Malcolm about this the other day, and he actually ended up using it in one of his games. It's just like 27 shades of cool because it worked like a charm for his players. But the idea is that basically while the main party was away doing heroic stuff and saving the land and what have you, leading up to that, they'd established there was a lot of foundation in the main city that they were in. They'd met a lot of characters, some uppity ups and some common folk, and there were people that were dear to them. There were vendors that were really memorable. There were things going on, and there were plots unhatching in the city that they had to, in the spirit of basically priority, earmark and say, we're going to come back to this later. And in the meantime, there is this big bad that's kind of unhatching a plot in the meantime. And the players were aware of it, but there were pressing concerns that they had to address validly, and all player choice, by the way, okay? And so they went off and they were doing their thing. And I said, all right, guys, today we're doing things a little differently. They've got the character sheets in front of them. I was like, open up your inboxes. So they opened up their emails, and I'd emailed them a bunch of characters. And these characters were orcs. And they were like, huh? And they're like, yes, you're playing these guys today because we're going to do a cutscene. We're going to play an interlude. This is happening simultaneously while your characters are doing this specific thing. I related it to time.
Yeah.
So the players, I anchored it for the players in the timeline. And they were like, okay, cool. And for them, it was absolutely outstanding because there were little descriptors of these, players, these characters that they were playing. They had the agendas. There were names and things like that. And then they were actually encountering NPCs whom I was describing as the bad guys, because now, you flip the narrative, right? You're looking at the story from the bad guys' perspective. So from the antagonist's perspective. So their antagonists are actually the good guys, right? They're the protagonists and the NPCs in the city. And I was describing them as, the antagonists of their agenda and things like that. And the players had to go through this experience of engaging with them. And there were some, bloodshed and, slaughter and all that good stuff that comes with orcish characters. But the players had fun in that session. But the repercussions of that sessions, the players knew. They're like, oh my God, we're going to go back to the aftermath of that mess. But at the same time, I had checked a whole bunch of boxes. I'd shown one that the players, well, first of all, we created a fun little interlude, first and foremost, right? It was nice to snap out of the main events of the story and see other things happening elsewhere in the setting. Two, the players actually saw the antagonistic forces move forward with their plot. And they actually felt as players that their characters are now going to have to deal with the consequences of having delayed certain things that maybe they should have prioritized higher. I personally didn't have a priority list, but in like inflicting them with that feeling that they're like, oh shoot, should we have focused on that first? That's great, because the players like really like it becomes memorable for the players.
That's a question that they'll keep asking themselves for a
Yeah,
while.
yeah, it will. It will.
Yeah.
It's definitely going to become a talking subject. It'll become something that they'll talk about and they'll remember, just because they know the NPCs over there. They've like now they're the bad guys, interacting with NPC characters whom the good guys actually really like. But more importantly, the players started seeing the machinations of the big bad. And they started learning a little bit more about the big bad, and that started coming to life. So you don't always have to introduce your players to the villain in a direct way. The player characters in a direct way. You can introduce the players to the villainous plot through devices like this or ideas like this, by stepping back from your main campaign, throw in an interlude. Meanwhile, this is what's happening over there, and just have at it. And I find it to be a very... it always becomes a talking point with my players when I do this. It always becomes a talking point.
Gives them a chance to blow off some steam too.
As well,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Separate and sort of do something different, especially when your campaign's been running for 6-7 months at that point. You know what I mean? And like it's a breath of fresh air for them as well, right? So.
Mhm.
Sorry, I wanted to add an extra point. I feel at times when I played and this is a point I always try to get right when I'm running as a DM, because as a player sometimes it breaks my immersion. But if people like it, that's their style of gaming. Dialogue, the villain's dialogue. I feel that's a point that people or DMs don't focus on a lot. They use the cliche dialogues. I will destroy you mortals, or the regular stuff, which I feel kind of makes it look like a Saturday night cartoon. I think it's okay if your game is a bit cartoonish and silly. That's great, but sometimes I feel it breaks the immersion for me.
Yeah.
When it comes to the villain's dialogue and what he's going to say to the players.
I suppose to me, I look at that as kind of like going the extra mile, because it really, and I don't know if Matt will agree with this or not. I think it comes down to you as a DM in terms of your personal ability to do that, right? Like if I were writing, I could probably choose or play around with narrative voice, but at a table, that's just so much harder. So it's actually easier to fall on those tropey kind of cliched sort of kitsch catchphrases and things like that. And I don't know if necessarily I can say with like confidence that my players don't expect that. Like I think it's somewhat expected to a degree. Like they're not waiting for me to Matt Mercer the game. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of.
I'm not saying voice acting. No.
I hear you. You. It's the choice of narrative, choice of words in the, in the dialogue. But I totally get that. Maybe with some like pre-prep, I could do something like that. But like,
it's a point to think about.
It's a worthwhile point to think about. But I find that it's for myself personally speaking, I don't do it. I don't do it. It's a little more than what I'm willing to invest in prep, because what if I never get an opportunity to say what I've been planning to say? You know what I mean? Because I think everyone here will agree with me that the players, you tell players you've got a plan, they'll laugh. You know what I'm saying? That's just how it is. That's how it is. Like it's nigh on impossible to predict how any particular session will go unless you completely like string them by the nose, which is not the best way to go about a game, to be honest, right?
Well, the trick is always to make the players not believe that you have a plan, but to make the players believe that everything happened according to plan. And chances are it didn't, but make them believe it.
Yeah, well said. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
So I think there was a lot to this question. I think we could talk, and I think the anecdotes are where you learn the most. Like you could talk about all of the tools extensively that you can use to bring life to your villains, but the pitfalls and the success stories I think are where where you can learn a lot, and that comes through experience. I think a lot of DMs need to get out there and try it for themselves, because as we found just now with the narrative style versus not, or you know, that every DM has their strength, and I think every DM should just play to their strength. But I really appreciate you guys coming on again. This is one of my favorite
Always a pleasure.
topics. It's one of my favorite topics, because the heart of a campaign is the conflict, and that conflict is through the villain and all of their henchmen. And if you've got a really good, energetic, believable, and maybe even a little bit sympathetic villain, you've got gold, you know. So, but I want to thank Ham, and I want to thank Nasser for coming on. We're going to do this a lot more. We've got a lot more shows. One of the things we're going to talk about in the future are the new trend with handicapped adventurers. I think there's a lot to say there, and for some reason it's controversial, but we'll talk about that in the future. But until then, I just want to thank you all for watching, and please listen to the War Mistress's message right after this video. She's got a lot of important things to say. Thank you all.
Wow.
If you like what we do here on the channel, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell, because it really helps us out.